Back in 1992, this was the place where the idea of a collective Europe turned into reality. Fast forward 30 years, achievements like a common currency, to move freely without borders have become ordinary. Our commitment to this ambition, born in the 90s, has never worn off. The spirit of the Maastricht Treaty is still running through our veins, working on Europe united in diversity. At this crossroads, we look forward without ignoring the challenges that brought us here. Generation Maastricht. Are you ready for Regeneration Maastricht? Let's take the future of Europe into our hands.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us here today. We're celebrating today 30 years of the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, the founding of the European Union. So thank you for joining us today. We are going to have a conversation with Frans Timmermans, and I'm going to ask him a lot of interesting questions, and you can also ask him questions. What will we be talking about? What did the generation of European politicians and policymakers envision 30 years ago when they were signing the treaty? What were the hopes for Europe in the new millennium? And how do these all the ideals compare to what younger generations want? And I'm here with Frans Timmermans, the Executive Vice President of the European Commission. Welcome. It's an honor to have you here to celebrate 30 years of the Maastricht Treaty. And I thought since this is an intergenerational dialogue, let's start with our dates of birth first. How old are you?
I'm 60.
60?
Yeah. I was born on the 6th of May, 1961.
Yeah. And
in Maastricht.
In Maastricht, yeah. So you're 30 years older than the treaty. I'm from 1988, so I was 4 years old when the treaty was signed. And with us today are students, and they are between 19 and 24 years old, so they're even younger than the Maastricht Treaty. And they are from 19 different nationalities. So welcome, students. It's great that you're joining us today. Yes, you can wave your hands. Hello. So they already sent us great questions, but they were also given the opportunity to ask the questions live. Mm-hmm. And if I mention your name, you will be unmuted, and then you can ask your questions to Frans Timmermans. Let's start. Let's go back to the 90s. Let's go back 30 years ago. What were you doing?
I was a diplomat working in Moscow, and the Soviet Union was falling apart around me. I had been living and working in Moscow for over a year. I went there in the early summer of 1990, and I would remain there until the autumn of 1993.
Yeah. We asked you to bring a picture.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you explain us?
Well, this is the famous picture of Yeltsin on the tank, and I was actually there, right there where the picture was taken, after having spent the previous hours in that building behind Yeltsin there, the White House, where he had already twice read out the speech he then came out to read on the tank. But this is an iconic picture, I think, which symbolizes his resistance to the coup d'etat that was ongoing at the time. And had he not done that, then things might have developed even worse in Russia over the years after that. Yeah. And what people should know is the moment he did that, all his men and women around him and he himself thought they would end up in prison or worse on that day. So they showed quite some courage.
Yeah. What did you think of the European Union? Well, it wasn't born then, but so early 90s. What were your ideas about it?
Well, I think the most important thing was that the most important event in my life, professional life, is the end of the European divide. So the fall of the wall in 1989. And the Maastricht Treaty is actually the reflection of Europeans trying to come to terms with the fall of the wall and the way Europe was going to change. So in those years, I was just fascinated by the rapidity of the change. All the things we had assumed before were eternal turned out to change and turned out to be very different than we had thought. And a fascinating time occurred. All these people finding democracy, working on becoming free European citizens. You know, if you had told me at the time, in 91, Poland and Czechia and Slovakia and all these other countries will be members of the EU in 2004, I would say that's absolutely impossible. But sometimes the impossible becomes reality.
Yeah, you lived in interesting times,
Absolutely.
as they say. Yeah.
Yeah.
What were the hopes and the ideals of European politicians that eventually signed the Maastricht Treaty?
Well, at this stage, it was mainly to avoid the end of the divide leading to a collapse of Central and Eastern Europe and leading to violent conflict between countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and especially also at the time with the Soviet Union. So what happened later in the former Yugoslavia was very much something politicians feared could happen on a European scale. And everything was actually in foreign policy directed at preventing that from happening. And I think we should always see the Maastricht Treaty in that context, the fear of instability leading to violent conflict in those years.
Yeah. Was it also the idea that Europe was on its own since the Cold War had ended now?
Not at all. That was not, because the Maastricht Treaty did not reflect on our immediate security issues. That was very much a NATO transatlantic issue. The Maastricht Treaty reflected on how do you operate on issues that are of importance for all Europeans in a much more diverse Europe. How do you accommodate that diversity and still are able to take decisions? Because the whole idea of Europe, small and big countries, was to find decision-making that would accommodate all the requirements of small and big countries. And that was the Maastricht Treaty was an attempt at accommodating that necessity of dealing with much more higher levels of diversity.
Yeah. How do you think these older ideals compare to ideals of younger generations right now? Is there a big difference between the 90s and now?
Well, I think there is a huge difference because I was raised to fight the other side of the Berlin Wall. I was raised as a Cold War soldier and then diplomat. Our idea was to defend our freedoms against an aggressive Warsaw Pact. When I was their age, if I looked at Eastern Europe, from a mile I could see who was from Eastern Europe. Different hairdos, different coats, different shoes, different attitudes. This was a deeply, deeply divided Europe. Your legacy of your generation is no longer to live in a divided Europe, which is sometimes a huge, huge gift that it goes unnoticed.
Yeah.
When I took my two oldest kids, who are now 35 and 33, on a tour of the Baltic states to show them my wonder that these real European countries, where you have the euro, where everybody looks like us, where they have the same music, for me that's a miracle. For my kids, it's normality. Yeah, this is Europe. Yeah, of course they listen to the same music. Of course they all have Spotify as we do, etc., etc. And for me, that's still a miracle because I saw how it was before 1989 and 1991.
Yeah. Let's go to the students. We have a question by Roy van Zetten. Roy, do we have you there? Let's see. He's in the top. Roy, what is your question for Frans Timmermans?
Yes, thank you. My question is, how does political engagement of young Europeans in the 90s compare to the political engagement of younger generations now?
Well, I think the big difference is, and you will not be surprised that I come up with that, the big difference is that we were only very limitedly engaged on environment and climate issues. We were very much engaged on security issues, on social issues, and now your generation is, of course, very much more aware of the risk of catastrophe because of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. The engagement is different in nature. It's not different in attitude. The subjects are different.
Yeah. Shall we dive a little bit deeper into the Maastricht Treaty? Not everyone maybe knows what's in it, what was it all about. So let's make that clear.
Can I be just sorry to come back because you deserve a bit longer answer to that. What is also the difference? And I hope this is going to change quickly now. We were very much more aware of the fact that we needed to organize. that we needed to sort of take over political parties, be more influential in political parties, get together with other young people, look for more momentum by number. Because of the internet and social media, your generation is too often thinks that if you put it in Facebook, it's done. Sometimes it is too atomized. Now, the Fridays for Future movement has shown that there is strength in numbers, strength in getting organized, strength in demanding things collectively. And I hope you will build on that, because we desperately need your generation to take over political structures and mold them in the image of what you think is important.
Do you agree, Roy?
Yes, I definitely agree. It needs more than just social media.
They're all very active. Yeah, go on the streets. Yeah, so let's dive a little bit deeper into the treaty itself. What was it? What was it all about? What were the most important achievements, if you could summarize it?
Well, the idea behind the need to have a new treaty was the following. On those issues where we had agreed to use the community method, which is qualified majority voting, with a distinct role for the European Parliament, a distinct role for the Commission as the only one who can make a proposal, things created a balance between big and small member states, and it allowed the European communities to act. Now, there were areas where this was not possible. There was no common currency, no common economic policy. There was no common policy on foreign affairs. There was no common policy on justice and home affairs. So the attempt, first of the Luxembourgish presidency of the Council, was, can we organize that? And they came up with the idea that, okay, you have all these issues that are of a monetary and economic nature. That could be under the umbrella of collective decision-making, community method. And then you have two other pillars, foreign policy. We're not ready yet. We need to streamline it more, but we're not ready yet. And then the third pillar, home affairs and security. There you can justice and home affairs. You can decide to work together, yes or no, etc. That was sort of the three pillars of the Luxembourgish proposal that ended up being the Maastricht Treaty. The Dutch had another approach. They said, a bit inspired by Jacques Delors, no, you need to apply the same logic to all the subjects. So you need to put a roof over the whole thing, which is the Commission being able to make a proposal exclusively, nobody else, and then decision-making by the European Parliament together with the Council of Ministers. And that was flatly rejected at the beginning of the Dutch presidency in September 91, and then from that moment on, the Dutch worked on the basis of the Luxembourgish proposal of a presidency before the Dutch to then have it land into the Maastricht Treaty, which succeeded in Maastricht in December.
And why was it rejected? What were the hopes and the fears behind
well,
it?
I think the reason why it was rejected are manifold, but I still believe the most important reason is that two nuclear powers in the EU, permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, did not want to put their foreign policy under a collective European umbrella. For the Brits, that's not a surprise. For the French, that was a bit of a surprise, but not entirely, because if you go back even further in history, 1954, when there was an attempt to create a European defence union, it was also the French who refused to do that because they wanted to retain their autonomy in defence. And here also the French wanted to retain much of their autonomy in foreign policy. Yeah.
So the goal was, what can we establish, what's possible, and maybe put the common policy, defence policy on the side.
Well, because the overarching sentiment in politics at the time was, how can we contribute to avoid instability in Central and Eastern Europe? We need to get these countries on board as quickly as possible. But for that, we need different forms of decision-making. Otherwise, you know, what you can do with 12 member states, you cannot do with ultimately 27. So you need to change the rules of the game. And you need to understand that we need to have a common currency to address that issue. And especially also to address the issue of unifying East and West Germany.
Yeah. Let's go to the students again. Sophia Molnar, she also has a question for you. Where are you, Sophia? Yes, what's your question?
Sorry, I'm here. Hi.
Welcome.
So my question is, how much of the goals of the Maastricht Treaty have been reached?
How much?
What do you think?
Yeah, how much has been reached?
Well, I think we've gone beyond. With the Lisbon Treaty, we sort of tried to fix some of the things we couldn't fix in the Maastricht Treaty. But some of the... so we have a common currency now. We're even recalibrating the economic and monetary policy now that we have to deal with different issues in the COVID pandemic. We're even looking into European bonds, for instance, green bonds. We've engaged into a collective exercise of investing in our economy, which is made possible ultimately because of the Maastricht Treaty. Where we haven't made enough progress, of course, is in the security and foreign policy area, where we're still, to some extent, stuck with what was decided in Maastricht, although we also increased that with the High Representative Vice President role. But in foreign policy, it all boils down to the question, are you able to find common ground? Are you able to accept that sometimes your views will not prevail and that it's better for the common good that you accept that the majority view is also your view?
Yeah. So the treaty actually, it has been adopted over these 30 years and changed, and maybe some goals were not reached. What are we celebrating?
Well, I think, me personally, I think it's very personal. For me, we're celebrating, in my view, we're celebrating that also with the Maastricht Treaty, we prevented to a large extent this fundamental change in Europe, which is the end of the European divide, ending up in bloodshed. Of course, we have the horrible, horrible situation in the former Yugoslavia. We had some horrible situations in the Caucasus as well. But by and large, this transition was peaceful. Even, one country decided to split up in a peaceful way, Czechoslovakia. So, and I believe Maastricht Treaty was a huge contribution to that because it made the perspective of enlarging the EU, or from the East, the perspective of joining the EU was made much more realistic through the Maastricht Treaty, and therefore gave hope to countries and gave them sort of a goal to work for. And it happened in 2004. Who would have thought that possible?
Yeah. So it's more that moment and preventing bloodshed and worse. What if you look at the treaty itself and the question
obviously
of Sophia?
It's economic and monetary union.
Yeah,
that is the most important in that.
Yeah.
But also sometimes we tend to think an economic and monetary union is a goal per se. It's not. It's just an instrument. And it's the instrument to create more stability and to create a perspective and to allow people from joining an economic area. The more an economic area is integrated, the more it will need common currency. And that's what we've seen. And that has worked very well.
Yeah.
I would dread to think what would have happened to Europe if in 2008, in the financial crisis, we would still have been stuck with all sorts of different currencies. That would have been a disaster.
Yeah. So the economic integration, the economic union was an instrument also to maybe remain a peaceful continent.
Indeed.
Yeah. So maybe also that's why we didn't need a political union with the economic union, because that was also the critique, of course. Like, should you start an economic union when you don't have a political union? What would you say?
Well, what if you define a political union as the United States of Europe? Frankly, that will never happen. Because then our reference point is the United States of America or the Federal Republic of Germany, things like that. That's not the form of statehood Europe will take. But in many aspects, we have a form of political union, not in the sense of constitutional political union, but in the sense of converging political ideas. And I think COVID is a case in point. We started off with 27 different ideas about national health care, etc. And we ended up with a common approach to vaccines, with a common approach to COVID passes so that we make life easier for our citizens, still with nuances and differences, without changing national competences, but still politically getting closer together. And I think that's also a form of political union that is not of a constitutional or legal nature, but of a purely political nature.
Yeah. Students, keep asking your questions live as well. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the significance of the Maastricht Treaty for Europeans and young people. If someone on the streets asks you, okay, how did it affect my life, the Maastricht Treaty, what would you say?
Again, it made possible the integration of Central and Eastern Europe into Euro-Atlantic structures, not just the EU, but also NATO. Sometimes people underestimate that aspect because you need to have stable societal relations, you need to have the rule of law, you need to have an economy that offers the possibility for the many, not the few. And all of that was made possible in the integration process into the EU. And at the same time, it brought the stability that would allow also for NATO to allow in new members. So it really contributed to the stability in Europe. Just as a thought, imagine that today Poland would not be member of the EU and NATO. Then what's happening in Ukraine would be happening in Poland. So in that sense, EU and NATO membership has changed our lives, has certainly changed my life. I just remind you that before you kids were born, I was a soldier trained, and I learned Russian because I was trained to fight the Warsaw Pact had they decided to attack us. And that is now all gone. That is something you don't even have to think about anymore.
Yeah. Let's talk about the launch of the Single European Market, which was also one of the pillars, right,
yes,
of the Maastricht Treaty. The idea was also that it was led to more competition, lower prices. Looking back on it, do you also think, okay, maybe the liberalization of markets was maybe also not a good idea? It had negative effects on workers and so on.
Well, I think the background of that is not the EU. The EU is a reflection of the background. The background is that in the middle of the 1980s, economies were not performing. There was a lot of social unrest. There was, the industry changed very rapidly. And under the influence of first Thatcher and then Reagan, the idea was more flexibility would create more dynamism, and deregulation would lead to more dynamism, and then there would be a trickle-down effect. People at the top would make a lot of money, and that would trickle down, and everybody would profit. Now, the first things happened, but it just made a small group of people incredibly rich. It disbalanced the relationship between capital and labor. Today in the Western world, it is so much easier to become rich with capital, whereas with labor it's much more difficult. It created huge differences in many countries, not in all, between those at the top and those in the middle and at the bottom. That is an ideological choice that was made in the early 80s as a reaction to things slowing down in the 70s, the oil crises, etc., etc. Now, the agreements we reached in the EU are a reflection of that, are not the cause of that. And at the same time, the wish to incorporate in the EU the idea of a social market economy is still alive and kicking. That's why we were able, as I promised in the election campaign, we were able to propose a European minimum wage. I campaigned strongly against, treating a 16-year-old kid with a Deliveroo pack as an entrepreneur. That's not an entrepreneur. Yeah. And so we're taking measures to correct those extremes.
So these are the new ideals compared to the old ideas of the 90s.
Indeed.
Yeah.
That's the difference. And the Maastricht Treaty, it didn't really have a position on these issues because the Economic and Monetary Union left social issues to the member states, first and foremost, and just looked at how can you have price stability? How can you prevent inflation from getting out of hand? Which authority should be doing that? We created an independent European Central Bank to do that. The currency performed extremely well. But the choices, economic choices and social choices, that's a different matter. And that is it could be done within the Economic and Monetary Union, but it's not the fault of the Economic and Monetary Union.
Yeah, it was a reflection of the ideas in
Indeed.
the 1990s.
Yes.
Of course, we had the economic crisis 10 years ago. Could you say, if you look back at the Maastricht Treaty, that they didn't think enough about crisis situations? What shall we do whenever there is an economic crisis?
I'm not so sure. I think, of course, the early 90s were a time of huge optimism.
Yeah.
Seldom seen optimism since the second.
I know, I was born,
World
I lived
War.
through the 90s.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and the 80s, you know, when I was a student, early 80s, were very bleak.
Yeah.
And I went to university thinking I'd be unemployed. So, you know, there was a huge boost. And then, of course, you know, in the early 80s, I mean, there's something that many of you, even into the middle of the 80s, we thought that there could be a nuclear Armageddon. We went into the streets protesting against the stationment of new nuclear weapons. That was our teenager years, our early 20 years. So that was gone all of a sudden, and we thought there would be a really new world where these controversies would no longer be part of the equation. So you should understand that was the optimism, and at the same time the fear for instability and turmoil. And those were the two driving forces at the time. That's how I remember those years more than anything else.
Yeah. So maybe they didn't think because of these.
Well, I mean, there would be a crisis down the line, and the only thing is, if I look at my own kids, they're a bit older, and I also have younger kids. The two youngest are 18 and 16, almost. But you know, your generation has gone from crisis to crisis, and we went from the fear for Armageddon to the euphoria of the end of, and you, okay, one crisis, and then there's the next crisis, and then the next crisis. I really feel for you, and especially now with COVID taking away two of the most explorative years of your life is wow, that's such a heavy burden.
Yeah.
But the crisis that happened in 2008, what you're referring to, would have been much worse without the Maastricht Treaty.
Yeah. Let's go from the single European market to climate change, and I think the question of Rodrigo Ortega is a nice bridge from one topic to the other one. Where are you, Rodrigo? Can you raise your hand? Yes, hi. Can you ask your question? Welcome.
Yeah, my question is, how can the green transition take place within our system of an endless growing economy?
How can the transition take place in our system of endless growing economy?
Well, we have to redefine growth. We have to redefine what we see as a society of well-being. The legacy of the first industrial revolution, which started 200 years ago and which spun out of control, is that on the basis of that economic model, abundance has become the norm. So to keep the economic model going, we had to buy more and more and more and more and more. And that system has now gotten completely out of control. The earth cannot sustain us if we continue in that model. But, you know, if just to be very personal, for my grandparents, for my grandfathers, having a car was beyond their reach. It was impossible. You know, working class people didn't own cars. For my father, having his own car was sort of the measure of his success. And the more he became successful, the bigger the car. And when he became really successful, he had 2 cars. For me, it's still an important thing because that's how I was brought up. For my kids, they want to get around. Yeah. They don't care about cars anymore. They care about moving around in a way that addresses their needs. Yeah. So my hope is for you know, my grandparents came out of the war working very hard to build up something. They knew they would not profit from it, but they knew their children would. And they educated their children, and we were educated with the idea, go for it. Go for it. And now we have to rekindle the feeling our grandparents had, and we have to be more modest and stop colonizing the future of our children with our behavior and change the behavior. So we need to redefine what is growth, what is sustainable growth. It is when it happens within the planet's boundaries.
Yeah.
It is when it happens when it is distributed fair in a society, but not just within a society, also within the global society. Because in Africa, 600 million people have never seen a light bulb or don't have electricity in their daily lives.
Yeah.
How fair is that? So we need to change some of our assumptions and behavioral patterns. And this generation gives me the hope, your generation gives me the hope that we can do that, because you are recalibrating your values on the basis of your needs and on the basis of your values.
But I can also imagine, great question by the way, that the European Union is also in its DNA to have this shared market and to promote economy and growth and so on. So it's really difficult to get it out of the DNA of the European Union.
We should not get it out of the DNA. You know, when you were talking about the internal market before, the critics of the internal market were saying, oh, all this high level of consumer protection, this high level of environmental protection, it's going to lead to a catastrophe for the European market, jobs will be gone. The opposite turned out to be true. Why? Because global players all wanted to be active on the European market. Yeah. And they complied with the environmental standards, the social standards, which immediately led also to improvement of the standards in other markets.
Yeah. So you have a key to the market and you can...
We should use the market in the same way again in the Green Deal. We should have high levels of standards of sustainability, create a circular economy, demand that products are repairable, and if they're not repairable, recyclable, and if they're not recyclable, that the products can do no harm. These are the things we need to set the highest standards. And people say, oh my, that will make us more expensive. And no, it will be exactly the same phenomenon as with the internal market. Everybody will want to be on this market, and we will see that we can have high levels of comfort, high levels of well-being without colonizing our children's future. And I think this is the most important thing we need to do in the years to come, and also show to the world that it can be done.
Yeah, everyone wants to be on the market, so use it to have stricter rules. And let's go to Charlotte Lenhart. She also has a question regarding. Thank you for all the questions so far. Yes, Charlotte, what's your question?
Yes, my question is, so you lead the European Green Deal and undoubtedly have faced resistance in bringing it forward. And I'm wondering, what have you learned of navigating through this resistance that might be useful for young people like us pushing for change?
Thank you.
Well, the biggest challenge for the Green Deal is people's lack of optimism. The idea that any change is a loss. So in this debate, we need to convince people that we will leave no one behind. So that nobody is left on the road in this transition. So the fundamental issue for the Green Deal is a social issue. It's a social question. How do you organize solidarity? What is a fair society? How do you get that done? I think this is the most crucial element. And the resistance will be from people who already have seen so little progress in their lives over the last 20 years. Rich people getting richer, but people doing ordinary jobs struggling. To make ends meet, and all of us should understand. And this is, I hope I can convey this message to you, to all of you. For people who are day and night wondering how they're going to make the end of the month, the end of life on Earth is not a concern to them. So they have to have the comfort that their lives are going to improve if you want them to engage in a transformational change which we all need to make. We underestimate sometimes the fundamental changes we will have to go through. It is feasible, but only if people find in themselves the optimism that at the outcome of this, they'll be in a better position. And if they themselves are not in a better position, at least their children will be in a better position. I think this is essential for this to work.
Yeah, and one of the concerns is, of course, that it will be too expensive for people who are not rich at all.
That's the second element.
Yeah, how do you deal with that?
To show to people that it's much, much more expensive to do nothing. The great illusion in this day and age, the great illusion that is propagated also in certain political circles, the great illusion is to tell people that if they do nothing, that everything will stay the same. You know, already with 1.1 degree temperature increase, we have tornadoes in the Czech Republic. We have 50 degrees Celsius in northwest Canada. We have locust infestations in Africa. We have floods in the whole of Europe. We have wildfires all the time. We have permafrost disappearing in Russia. That's with 1.1 degrees. Imagine what would happen if we went to 2 degrees or 3 degrees or 4 degrees. Parts of the world would become inhabitable. And that would be a huge, huge security problem for the whole world. Our kids would be fighting wars over water and food. And people will say, there he is with his Project Fear. This is science talking. This is not Project Fear. And I believe the sooner we understand this, the sooner we will mobilize the force to avoid this from happening.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that the internal market was actually an instrument to promote peace or avoid...
Yes.
How would you characterize the moment we're in now when it comes to the Green Deal? Like, how can we use the internal market, or how can we use ideology or politics to prevent a disaster happening?
Well, you know, if you have a long-term transformational goal, you also have to have shorter-term results to show that this transformational goal is worth investing in. Mm-hmm. So what we need to do in the next couple of years is to show that electric mobility is cheaper, is to show that bringing green to cities, trees and parks, and bringing emission-free mobility to cities, bicycling lanes to cities, improves living in cities, is to show that reducing emissions leads to much better air quality, that we could do something to make our forests healthy again, that we can change our consumption patterns so that we avoid primary forests from disappearing, that we improve the social conditions in the textile industry. All these things can be done, and they can be done short term in the next couple of years. And that, in my view, will create the momentum for people to start really believing in our power to transform ourselves, to learn to live within planetary boundaries.
Yeah, so they have to see it also in their neighborhoods. Indeed. And see how it works for them as well.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
Let's go to Thanos Pakoutsos. Where are you? Welcome. What's your question?
Coming from Greece and the cold region of Western Macedonia, I would like to ask Mr. Timmermans, compared to earlier mine closings in Europe, how are youth communities of today's coal regions going to participate in the economic and environmental transition of the regions, and how it will affect them? Thank you very much.
I think this is an incredibly fascinating question, especially for someone like me who's from a coal mining region, and both my grandfathers were coal miners. And we made many mistakes in the past. Greece is a huge positive example of transiting out of coal. Greece is now closing its last lignite mines. And lignite is the most polluting of all coal sorts. So, and Greece has offering alternatives to those communities. Alternatives in renewable energy, alternatives in the services industry, alternatives in industrial production. What the Greek authorities have understood very clearly is that if you want just transition, you have to offer something not in a macroeconomic aspect for the whole country, but for the specific region and the specific people who are affected. You know that in my own home region, Maastricht is a good example for this. Because Maastricht University was invested in by the government as compensation for closing of the mines. Now, this of course led to a lot of pain in the coal mining region. Why not put the university in the coal mining region? Well, yeah, but Maastricht, they had buildings they could use, a historic city, it's more attractive for students. It's all very true. But then don't tell us it's because of you want to invest in coal mining regions where you've closed the coal mines. Other investments were in the coal mines. Some of the, especially the public authorities, did invest in those regions, bringing occupation to the regions, such as the pension fund for all the people in the public sector went to Heerlen. An open university was also put in Heerlen. So, but the private sector took the money and invested it very poorly in in industries where coal miners didn't feel appreciated. You know, and I need to expand a bit on this. Coal miners are a very special breed of people. They are working class people, but they make a lot more money than other working class people. So if you want to offer them an alternative, you have to think about that. And they have a very deep sense of pride and collectiveness. Why? Because like in the military, if you're in the coal mining business, your survival depends on your comrade in the mine. So it creates a very strong feeling of solidarity. You need to exploit that and bring them into industry that is also technical, that is also linked to making things in the energy sector and other sectors they can relate to.
Do you have an example of something that's already going on in Europe where the coal mines were replaced with something else that worked for these former coal workers?
It's very, very different from country to country. But let's stay, we're in Belgium. Let's stay in Belgium, especially in the coal mines that were among the latest to be closed in Western Europe, in Limburg in Belgium. They were able to bring whole sets of new services industry to that region. They opened 2 big car factories in that region. Sadly, one is closed. Sadly, one is closed again. And they brought a cultural revival based on the tradition of the mining industry. If you go to Genk right now, which was the heart of the mining industry, you will see that they have retained the industrial heritage elements and added a cultural element to that. So you have theatre, you have a museum and all that. That brings pride to the region. In my home region, they thought, well, let's bury it. Literally bury all of it. And they called it going from black to green. But then you take away also a cultural element that has grown during the mine industry, that created also social cohesion in the mine industry. And again, I say, like in Poland, in some of the early closures of the mine industry, they brought industrial production there, using other primary materials, building electric buses. Poland is now the biggest exporter in Europe of electric buses. So there are really things we can do. And why are we in a better position now than in the 70s? Because of demographics. We need every single able-bodied person in Europe to take a job, because otherwise we will not get the Green Deal done, because we don't have enough people. Yeah. So there is, in principle, no need to fear unemployment, unless you don't have the skills you need for the job. So skilling and reskilling, especially also of younger people, not you guys, you're all in university, that's a different thing, but especially people who don't have access to university, they need to be able to learn a job as a technician or as somebody working in construction or in logistics, etc., etc. Yeah. We need every single person in Europe to keep our economy going.
You mentioned culture and heritage. I can imagine also with the whole discussion on eating meat. I believe in Spain there was a whole debate about it. We should be proud of eating meat. And everyone knows that in order to reach the Green Deal or the climate goals, that we should eat less meat. How do you deal with that part of culture and heritage when it comes to these kind of controversial topics almost?
Well, in my view, not to tell people what they should do. People should make their own choice, but informing people. I am absolutely convinced that if people understand what their carbon footprint is in the choices they make, whether it's what they eat or how they travel around or what they buy in terms of stuff and clothes, etc., if they know what the consequence of their behavior is, they're willing to reconsider that behavior. If we tell them without them knowing, you should do this, you should do that, they won't do it. That's clear. But already now you see people, especially young people, reconsidering the amount of meat they eat. Why? Because they're being told? No, because they're informed about the consequences. And I think the task of public authorities is to inform people. And sometimes these cultural changes go very quickly. Something you probably can't even relate to anymore, but it went so quickly, smoking. I remember when I think Ireland was the first country to ban smoking in pubs and restaurants, and then other countries followed. And everybody in the services industry was saying this is the end of pubs and restaurants. Well, the opposite happened, because now the air is much better, and more people also bring their families into pubs and restaurants. So, you know, and this is a fundamental cultural change. When I started in politics, I used to go to meetings and smoked during the meeting with I don't know how many people there, even cigars sometimes, and nobody minded.
Yeah.
And that's gone in a very short period of time. And I think in other areas, this sort of cultural change can happen much more quickly. And once it has happened, we've forgotten that's a cultural change. In my country, there's a discussion going on, very topical, very difficult, very painful, on blackface. And then you see, there was such a controversy and people thought, oh my God, there's going to be civil war about this. But people adapted very quickly, and now it's almost a non-issue. So, also these things where we think culture only lives if it moves. Static culture is dead culture. And we should derive some optimism from that. We can change our habits, but not by telling people, but by informing people, let them make their own choices. It took a while for people to understand that people of color felt insulted by blackface. But once they understood, okay, you feel insulted. I didn't see that, but now I understand. Okay, we'll do it differently. That's what I like about societies where we are interested in other people's views instead of just sticking to our own bubble.
Yeah, it's an ongoing discussion we're in. Yeah. Keep asking your questions live. Very interesting questions so far, so thank you very much. Let's also talk a little bit more on geopolitics. One of the questions we already received was, are the agreements made under the Treaty of Maastricht still sufficient for addressing all the challenges we face today when it comes to geopolitics?
Well, it's like culture.
30-year-old treaty.
Indeed, it's like culture. Also, politics and treaties, they need maintenance and they need to be adapted to new challenges.
Yeah.
For a longer period of time, we thought confrontation in Europe was a thing of the past. Now we see that Mr. Putin is trying to rekindle the Cold War spirit, and only unity will dissuade him from that. It's a different situation than in the Cold War, but the effects could be the same, dividing Europe. And we need to do everything we can to avoid that.
Yeah.
Does that immediately need a treaty change? No, but we need to have a discussion about, for instance, qualified majority voting in foreign policy, or nuancing the unanimity rule in foreign policy, perhaps working a bit more with the consensus rule and allowing for member states to say, okay, I don't really agree with that, but go along with that because it is in the interest of the collective European position. So these are the things we need to do right now.
This is the maintenance we have to do.
Well, just to look at it from a geopolitical standpoint, a country like Russia is no longer capable to dominate, but it is very capable to disrupt. And what is its idea of the EU? To pretend it isn't there. Because if it has to deal with the EU, which is much bigger in terms of people, 500 million vis-a-vis 145 million in Russia, if it has to deal with the EU in economic terms, the EU is much bigger. But if it can carve up the EU in individual member states, then it becomes bigger again vis-a-vis the EU. So that's what they're trying to do. And the only ones who can create a success for Russia and Putin are Europeans themselves, if we let ourselves be.
So it's a test.
It's a test. It's a test of our solidarity. It's a test of our resilience. And we are only weak if we are divided. If we are united, we are so strong. I mean, it's an old truth. But in this world that is developing so quickly, in a generation's time, we Europeans will only be 4% of the world's population. Do we then still think in 19th century terms of big powers, France, Germany, etc., the United Kingdom? The European Union will only have two types of member states, small ones and very small ones.
Yeah. Let's go to a question of a student again. Wim van der Velden. What would you like to ask Frans Timmermans?
Hi, my question is, given your experience in external affairs and defense, how realistic are the French efforts towards a European strategic autonomy in securing a solid position for the EU in the world?
Well, different member states have different starting positions on this. But it is my firm belief that there is no security in Europe without a strong transatlantic bond. We need that. But there is no strong transatlantic bond without a stronger unified European approach to our security. Because the Americans, and this is independent of who's president, are going to be increasingly fed up with Europeans taking, in their view, a free rider position, not contributing to our collective defense in a balanced way. So because we are too divided on this, we're wasting too much money. We're not taking collective decisions on procurement, on the means we need, etc., etc. It's weakening us, and it's annoying our transatlantic partners, and I can understand them being annoyed. So if we believe the future of our security for a long, long period of time will be based on a transatlantic relationship, because we share fundamental values with the US, unless they take a completely different direction, which I certainly don't hope. And secondly, that transatlantic bond needs maintenance by Europeans, showing that they understand they have to take a greater responsibility for their own defense. And we can only do that not by hugely increasing in every member state the amounts of money we spend. Yes, some more money will have to be spent, but especially by doing things much more in an integrated way, both in terms of procurement of weapons, but also in terms of operational capacity.
Can we compare it to the Netherlands and how their stance is right now when it comes to geopolitics and the European Union? If we compare it to France, what's the difference?
Well, I think the Netherlands, historically, the Netherlands has always felt it wanted to stay out of European politics. If you go back from the very origins of the Netherlands, especially once in 1648, when the war with Spain was settled, then the Netherlands became worried about France, and it became worried about Spain again. We'd rather go to the high seas than be sort of drawn into European politics. That's our traditional. That also explains why we tried to stay neutral in the first half of the 20th century. So the neutrality reflex will always be a bit there in the Netherlands. Having said that, there's also now a strong understanding that our collective security depends on our ability to act collectively. And I believe, especially the very, very, very traumatic experience of the shooting down of MH17, which led to 298 innocent people being killed, of whom 196 were Dutch, has driven home this point that our collective security, we had such a, at the time I was foreign minister, we had such a positive and strong solidarity outpour from our allies and partners, that it showed that if you are part of a family, the family will stand up for you, but then you also have to stand up for the family when you're called upon to do that. And I think that has improved the international attitude of the Netherlands in the last couple of years.
Yeah. So maybe many countries have their ups and downs when it comes to faith in the European Union, and also when it comes to defense, and yes. Maybe now the Netherlands is going up again.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. But it's always like in any other country. It's enlightened self-interest. You always analyze your own interest, and sometimes your own interest is best served in collective action. And this is something that the Netherlands learned. And in Europe, in the EU, the Danes did it before us. They had years, especially after their membership. They became members in '73, and then especially in the late 80s, early 90s, it was no, 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 no to everything. And then the Danes just had a rethink. And they thought, wait a minute, that's not bringing us very much. We should have some very specific points where we don't work with Europe, and we should engage in many other points that will give us the credibility to be allowed to do something differently in other points. And it worked like a charm for them. And I think the Netherlands has now also reached the conclusion positive engagement gets you more than just saying no, no, no.
Yeah. We have some live questions. Let's see. Olsi, where are you? I don't know your last name, but Olsi, oh yeah, your hand is up. Yes,
I should be
welcome.
here. Yeah.
What's your question?
Thank you. Mr. Timmermans, you mentioned the importance of the Maastricht Treaty for countries like Poland and Czech Republic to feel integrated in the European dream. However, should future policymakers of our generation strive for lower thresholds to broaden the European Union, or rather intervene for further integration between our current member states?
Well, I think one of the lessons we should learn, one of the reasons why enlarging the EU has now become so difficult, is because the EU sometimes has difficulty managing the diversity within the EU. So, especially in the oldest member states, people are saying, hang on, can we handle even more diversity? We already have so much difficulty in handling this diversity. So that is a sentiment we need to deal with very carefully. In that context, attacks on the rule of law in some of our member states have increased the feeling that we can't handle more member states. Now, interestingly enough, sometimes the countries where the attacks on the rule of law are happening are also the countries who want enlargement as quickly as possible. And by their own behavior, they're making enlargement more difficult. So I don't think there is any other solution for stability, long-term stability and prosperity on the Western Balkans than being members of transatlantic and European organizations. I don't think there's another solution. So we need to prepare for that. But I have full understanding for member states saying, well, wait a minute, then we have to be sure we have strict criteria, because the criteria for membership are getting stricter. They're not getting looser. And because of this attitude, we are strict until you're a member, and once you're a member, we no longer continue to be strict. That's the wrong attitude. That's wrong. You know, it's like if you it's easy to criticize somebody who's not a member of your family, not sitting at your table. Once they're a member of your family and sitting at your table, then it becomes crucial you criticize, but also much more difficult.
Yeah,
and the EU is struggling with that.
Mm-hmm. But is now the strategy to wait to get a new family member, you know, like hope that there's change within a country so that they will still, follow the strict rules?
Well, I think we have a collective responsibility in enforcing the rule of law, because without the rule of law, there's no EU.
Yeah.
And if we allow the rot in the rule of law to become endemic, then I fear for the future of the EU. Yeah. So there is a strong political will not to let that happen. But you have to translate that political will also in action in the Council of Ministers. And I see that not enough.
No, yeah. So then you're waiting for it to improve, maybe?
No, we at the Commission, we maintain our activities. We have very strong support in the European Parliament. I would even say the European Parliament is more ambitious even than we are in some aspects. So we work hand in hand with the European Parliament. It's the Council we need to convince to stand up to some of its own members if that is necessary.
Yeah, very challenging, I assume. Daniel Wenzel also has a live question. Where are you, Daniel? Hi. Welcome. What's your question?
Hi, thank you. Yes, Mr. Timmermans, I would like to ask, how do you see the EU Green Deal affecting the redistribution of wealth and the cooperation on a global scale? Thank you.
Thank you.
It's an excellent question. One of the most daunting challenges. You know, if we want 10 billion people to live on this planet the way we want to live, then we all have to live differently. We are in fact colonizing our kids' future because we're using much more than the planet can provide, and then we still have billions of people who are underdeveloped, who also want what we have. So we need fundamental reorganization. We need the countries who are developing to avoid the mistakes we have made in our industrial revolution. We need them to move immediately to renewable energy, of which we have more than enough. Solar energy is the cheapest energy humanity has ever seen, and it can be attained everywhere, especially in developing countries where sun is present in abundance. And you can bring energy to the remotest communities, energy they can control themselves, that will give them access to the digitized world, which has a low threshold. So we have huge opportunities, but we need to bring that development to developing countries, because otherwise they will say, wait a minute, you're telling us now to reduce our emissions. What emissions? We don't even have emissions. So what is our opportunity to take part into this well-being you see as self-evident for yourselves?
Yeah.
And if we don't have an answer to that question, the whole thing will collapse.
But how can the EU cooperate with these countries, or do they share? Is it open science? Do they share their science?
First of all, if you look, let me take Africa as an example. 600 million people have no access to electricity in Africa. 600 million people. That continent will increase its population with 1 billion in the next generation. And we will still be 500 million in Europe. So the demographics will be radically different between us and Africa. Young Africans are increasingly healthy. They have access to more and more education. They are very successful in education. They are the future of the planet if we give them the tools to build that future. So what we need to do is to bring the technology, especially bring the energy transition to Africa, which is not that difficult. I mean, it's a challenge, but investing in solar and wind is relatively cheap, and it yields immediate results. And then offer them access with their products on our market without any restrictions. Hopefully, because of the abundance of solar energy, they will make a lot of green hydrogen with that solar energy they can export to Europe, because we will be needing much more green hydrogen than we can produce ourselves. All of these things are opportunities, but you need to get it organized. And much of that will have to go through private investment. So what is hindering private investment in many developing countries? The risk of corruption, the risk of losing your investment. We need to improve that as well. We need to talk about the rule of law in those countries. We need to offer investment protection. We need to sort of also give seed money. We need to have technology transfers. We need to have more access to our universities from young people, or bring universities there, etc., etc., etc. That is our task for the next generation.
Yeah. And we also need more people, maybe?
Yes, we do. We need to have a much more
workers.
We need to have a much more relaxed relationship with the issue of migration. Circular migration is an answer, because then we can get people to come here and do jobs and learn skills that they can then take back to their countries. But we've become in Europe, since the refugee crisis of 2015 and 16, so afraid of migration per se, that we risk acting against our own interest if we just say no to any form of migration.
Yeah. Loud and clear. We're already talking about the future a lot, but let's move from the past 30 years to the future. And we have some questions on the future of the Maastricht Treaty and maybe some changes, some lessons we learned. Beata Beliavska has a question. Beata. Hi.
Hello. Yes. I would like to ask if you could indicate 3 mistakes and lessons learned from the 30 years of European cooperation within the EU that can be useful for future. Thank you.
I think. Well, first and foremost, what I said earlier, we're strict for countries that want to join, and once they are in, we hesitate to be as strict, and that is a huge mistake, because it gives countries the impression they can get away with anything. So that is a lesson we should have learned, and we need to apply. The second lesson is we were much too late in devising a Green Deal agenda. Had we done that 10 to 15 years earlier, we would not now have these incredibly high energy prices in Europe, and we would not have this dependency on Russian gas that we have today. So I hope we learn from that, and we speed up our transition into renewable energy and speed up our investment in the economy to come. I also believe that we should have put more energy in a common foreign and security policy than we have. We've neglected that a bit too much, probably thinking a bit too much that there was détente that would be eternal, and not thinking about the new security challenges that were coming up very rapidly. Another thing we need to look at again is our trade arrangements with the outside world. We need to make sure that our own environmental goals and our climate goals are also reflected in the agreements we reach with our international partners. And we need our trade agreements to reflect our wish to stop deforestation of primal forests, to stop social exploitation of children and people in a vulnerable position, etc., etc. So just a few
Many
things.
more lessons.
Just a few
three.
things of lessons learned.
Thank you. Thank you for your question as well. A next question by Nuaban Azarzar. Hi, welcome.
Hello. Can I ask the question right now?
Yes, you can. Yes.
So, Mr. Timmermans, do you think a treaty revision or a new treaty is the next step in the evolution of the European Union?
Good question.
Well, you know, no treaty is forever. So at some point, treaty revision will be on the table again. Although we also know that treaty revision with 27 member states is a very, very complicated affair. But before we get there, I think we are under an obligation to use all the possibilities of the existing treaty. And so you can only demand treaty change if you can prove that you've reached the limits of the possibilities of the existing treaties. And I frankly believe we have not reached the limits yet of the possibility of the existing treaties. The Green Deal we can do within the existing treaties. The digitization of our economy we can do within the existing treaties. And we also have a lot of flexibility in the existing treaties, for instance, on the economic and monetary union that we can use in this period. Where we need a lot of flexibility.
Yeah. You experienced no problems whatsoever with the Green Deal because of something is not in the treaty, in the Maastricht Treaty or other treaties.
Of course, there's treaties thinkable that would make my life easier. But I want to invest. In tackling the climate crisis, and I don't want to be sort of distracted by spending a lot of time on treaty amendments.
Yeah, but maybe other people will say. You should arrange that the treaties maybe are democratic and workable, and if you do it yourself, maybe it's less democratic than if you make a new treaty?
Well, who's going to make that treaty? It's the same people that always make the treaties.
Yeah.
What I want,
Parliament who will do it.
What I want is like we're organizing now, is public debates where people who engage can give us their priorities, and then we can see can we deliver on those priorities within the existing treaties, or do we need treaty change for that? And that, I think, is the essence of the Conference on the Future of Europe.
Yeah. Could you explain a little bit about it?
As far as my area of expertise is concerned, my job is concerned, I'm encouraged by the fact that whenever we ask European citizens, what is your top priority, what should Europe be doing, the climate crisis is always on top of that. That I know that's my job, but I still believe I can deliver on that job within the existing treaties. Is there a better treaty thinkable for me? Absolutely, obviously. If we get more competences, that would make my life even easier. But I think my priority should be on delivering on Fit for 55, the plans we have to reduce our emissions. And if I myself would engage now in, I can only do this with treaty change, then I'd unleash a huge debate between member states and other stakeholders that would slow down the process in adopting the legislation I need for Fit for 55. And obviously in the Conference on the Future of Europe, ideas will come about how we do things differently. And my personal attitude to those is, okay, very good. I want to listen very carefully to what our citizens want. First of all, I want to make sure that all citizens are involved, because sometimes in these processes, it's the same old people, like Yogi Berra said, it's déjà vu all over again for me in the last 30 years. But now this Conference on the Future of Europe seems to be able to engage with a wider audience. Also thanks to the fact that France has given a good example with the conferences they have organized on the future of France and Europe, engaging with many more citizens. The results of that are really encouraging. But the danger is it for people like you and me and the students is to then immediately jump, okay, so we need treaty change. No, people want us to deliver on their worries. What are we going to do about the climate crisis? Why can't I get affordable housing? Why do I have to fear that my kid will not have a job? Why is there not more security in the streets? These are the things people want to be addressed. And if you answer that with, yes, well, first we need treaty change, they will be very disappointed.
Yeah. So you want to involve European citizens. You already mentioned the conference on the future of Europe. It's in a couple of days. Can you explain a little bit for those of you who don't know?
Well, what we do is engage with the widest possible audience of European citizens to hear from them where their priorities are, which issues they want us to address, and then we will make up our mind in the different institutions, Parliament, Council, and Commission. Yeah. Does this need? What can we deliver within the existing treaty framework? What can't we deliver, and where would we possibly need a treaty change? We don't exclude it, but it's the object of the operation is to get people engaged, to listen to people, to understand what their priorities are. The goal is not per definition to get treaty change.
Yeah, you want input of citizens. I think there's a wonderful question regarding this by Mart. Live question. Where are you, Mart? Hi, welcome. What do you want to know?
So I wanted to ask, how do you see the future of citizen involvement in EU decision-making, taking into consideration the Conference of the Future of Europe and also European Citizens Initiatives? Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
The idea of citizens' initiatives is gaining ground, and it was initially seen as sort of it was one of the results. I was part of that, of the convention on the Constitutional Treaty, and we've worked very hard to get it done. We got it done. Initially, the NGO community, the outside world, needed to familiarize themselves with the instrument. So the Commission had to reject some of these initiatives because they didn't comply with the rules of the game. But now, increasingly, the rules are becoming sort of ingrained into the activities of civil society. And step by step, we're seeing citizens' initiative that will have concrete results also in policy making. One that comes to mind immediately is about the access to water, which came from a citizens' initiative and actually led to policy changes at the European level. And I think we will see more of that in the near future, especially also linked to issues of the climate crisis and the biodiversity loss. So that is moving forward rather well. My worry is a bit, how do we make sure we expand this debate to parts of society that usually don't engage with these issues? And then, since our democracy is based on relationship within society that don't exist anymore, or voting once every 4 or 5 years, things like that, that are very sometimes quite distant for people who have a huge difference in engaging. If you look at these programs where you can choose who's the best singer, or you can vote from your home, and your vote is immediately recorded. Can we not, introduce these sorts of elements also in political decision making?
Voice of Europe.
Yes, and then not necessarily a referendum, because a referendum is a very, very conservative instrument.
Yeah, it's only yes or no.
But there's a Flemish writer, David van Rijbroek, who's come up with the idea of a preferendum, which would then, you could vote for your preferences, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you get a much more nuanced image of what sort of salad bowl of choices people would make, and then that would really inform decision maker much better than a referendum, which is always by its nature black and white. So, but what I'm saying, I'm just quoting David van Rijbroek because I think it's an interesting idea. But we need to rethink the way we relate to policy making and policy execution, and that relationship is based on early 20th century ideas when voting was step by step extended to the whole of the population, but that was still at a time when the means of communication were not generalized as we have now. So the means of communication that are now very often used, especially social media, to disrupt, to undermine rational thinking, to allow people to stay in a bubble and hate the other bubbles, should be used to create more of a sense of community, to engage more with people, to give them more of a voice and a say in things. I hope we can do that in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think we already did that a little bit today in our intergenerational conversation. So I'd like to first thank the students. Thank you for all of your wonderful questions, the new generation coming up. I'd like to thank you, of course, for your answers today and this little celebration. but also a lot of critique or maybe things to improve when it comes to the Maastricht Treaty. Thank you for being here today.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, and let me say to you, thank you for watching. And maybe some final remarks. Go to Studio Europa Maastricht. .nl if you want to know more or discuss further topics. And throughout 2022, Studio Europa Maastricht will continue to organize all kinds of events on European cooperation, so join us. And the special program Regeneration Maastricht calls upon all generation to work on a better Europe, so join us on that. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you again, Frans Timmermans.
Bye-bye to everyone at home.
Bye.
Back in 1992, this was the place where the idea of a collective Europe turned into reality. Fast forward 30 years, achievements like a common currency, to move freely without borders, have become ordinary. Our commitment to this ambition, born in the 90s, has never worn off. The spirit of the Maastricht Treaty is still running through our veins, working on Europe united in diversity. At this crossroads, we look forward without ignoring the challenges that brought us here. Generation Maastricht. Are you ready for Regeneration Maastricht? Let's take the future of Europe into our hands.